All right. Well, I have a few announcements and intros before handing it off to our speaker. My name is Shannon Sheehy. I am the manager of the speakers team here at Code U, and I'm excited for you all to be here tonight for our Monday guest speaker series. The careers team is always working on really cool events and opportunities for you all. So keep an eye out in Slack for information on those. We're also working on building out our schedule for the Monday guest speaker series, which is going to include a grad panel here in a few weeks where some recent grads are going to tell you about the jobs that they've gotten in tech, which is always a hit. If you're part of the January cohort and you're attending for your tech event, please just remember to fill out the form in your module in Top Hat. And then just a few housekeeping items. Please keep yourself muted if you are not talking. If you do have questions, there's a hand raising feature. You can also throw questions in the chat. I will monitor that just for our speaker, just for some ease there. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dave Hatter. Dave is a cybersecurity professional. He's a returning speaker for us from the Northern Kentucky, Cincinnati area. And we're so happy to have you back. Thanks so much for being here with us, Dave.
Well, thanks for having me, Shannon. I'm going to turn the camera off since it doesn't really provide any value during the presentation. But yeah, I'm happy to answer questions as we go along and look forward to any feedback. Happy to be back. And hopefully this is going to cooperate. Here we go. So a little bit about me. I was a software engineer for most of my career, 25 plus years. Really kind of got out of it and transitioned into cybersecurity. And I'll talk a little bit about why, because it dovetails into what I want to talk about tonight. I got a BS in information systems from NKU. I'm a lifelong Kentuckian. I've been an adjunct at Cincinnati State and Gateway off and on for more than 20 years, primarily teaching programming, which I still do, even though I'm not doing it professionally anymore. And I think another thing that I bring a unique perspective on this is after 26 plus years in local government, 8 terms on city council and 3 terms as mayor of Fort Wright, I have some insight into the critical infrastructure aspect of this, which is one of the things I really want to talk about tonight. So I want to set the table here a little bit. I don't think it comes as any surprise that software is eating the world. Everything has software in it now. Everything is smart, quote unquote. More on that in a minute. And as we add more software to things, they get more complex. They create more surface area for attack. And we're seeing more and more of that. We're in this digital first economy now. Software defined everything. And as a software guy, part of me loves this. Again, it's what I did for 25 years, primarily building business software, that sort of thing. But, you know, the ability to configure things with software, to have software defined switches, routers, all that sort of stuff brings a lot of flexibility to the mix. But it also brings both the capability for vendors to do things like decide to charge you a subscription to use the heated seats in your car, or tell you that you can't fix something that you bought because of digital rights management and the fact that they own the intellectual property, as well as create a ever increasing surface area of attack. Again, I'm going to talk more about that specifically, and we just see more and more and more of that. So this article, though, was one of 2 things that got me out of software development and into cybersecurity. So like I said, wrote software, have an information systems degree from NKU. From the time I walked out of college until around 2016, all I did was software. That was it, exclusively. Last 10 years or so of that was all .NET, SQL Server type stuff. But I've worked with a bunch of different technologies over the years. And I read this article one day as I was already starting to get concerned about security. And for those of you who've been on either side of this mix, if you're not a security person, my guess is if you've interacted with security people in the real world, you often see them as your enemy. They're the department of no. They're coming and telling you, no, you can't do that. No, you have to do this instead. And often in my case, as a third-party vendor, the security people of my customers would often get involved at the last possible minute. In many cases, I was the shadow IT vendor. Some business person wanted some software that their team couldn't build, wouldn't build, or whatever, and they would take it external to a company like mine, and we'd just build stuff. So the security people get involved, and, you know, I'm trying to hit a timeline and a budget. I'm much more focused on that than I am privacy or security. Again, a key aspect of where I'm going to take this tonight. And, you know, they would just cause me all kinds of problems. The last full-time gig, so I sold my business, went to work for the company that bought it. That didn't work out, ended up back in the corporate world And I managed a team of about 8 or 9 developers. We were working on converting about 1,000 lines of Pascal code to a .NET web-based application. And the security people show up one day and they're like, hey, you and your team have local admin permissions to your PCs. You can't have that anymore. We're going to install Beyond Trust. I don't know if any of you have experienced something like Beyond Trust, but the idea is it's software that will allow you to get the permissions you need without having local admin permissions on your box. So we had the Delphi IDE, we had the Visual Studio IDE, we had SQL Server installed, we had SQLite installed, we had all these unique configurations. And I said, okay, because I was still doing development myself with this team, like, you're going to break every one of us, we won't be able to do anything. They're like, oh no, this will work just fine. Well, what do you think happened? 3 days later, they had to roll everything back because, of course, it blew up all our IDs and we couldn't do any work for 3 days. But all of that's to say, again, I've had a lot of bad experiences over the years with the security people because I didn't see things from their perspective. Again, as a software developer, engineer, programmer, whatever you want to call it, I was generally focused on how do I get this done as fast as possible so I can make my timeline and my budget. I was not focused on things like privacy and security or necessarily even things like robustness, as long as the functionality was there and it would basically work, right? Those were the things I was focused on. Would argue my incentives were all totally wrong at the time. And that's why we're in such a bad state today, the abysmal state of software security, as I mentioned in the headline. So I stumbled into this article in the Atlantic it's almost 10 years ago now. And I read this, and you can see here, coming software apocalypse, a small group of programmers wants to change how we code before catastrophe strikes. And they're not even focused in this article on cyber attacks. They're focused on the fact that as more software gets added to things, and this software calls this API, which uses some library, which calls some other API, you're adding in all this complexity. There's no visibility. There's no transparency. No one knows where this stuff comes from. No one knows that things are maintained anymore. It's not clear what vulnerabilities there may be in something that's buried several levels down in the dependencies of your software. And also, because of this complexity, it's increasingly difficult to test this stuff and know every state. I really encourage you all to read this article. It was quite eye-opening for me. And after, they had some really interesting examples in there. One of the stories they told, I think if I remember correctly, it was a 911 system, I think in Colorado somewhere. It was really old. Think legacy software, technical debt. I'm sure these are terms you've heard before, or if not, we can talk about in more detail at the end. But when the thing was originally designed, memory was at a premium. Memory was very expensive. So programmers like me would take shortcuts. Instead of creating a variable that could store like a long or a float or something, you might use a short because you needed to conserve memory. Well, due to shortcuts in the code, because someone didn't anticipate the software running for more than 30 years, eventually it generated a number too large for the data type that was assigned to store that value. Application crashes. No one knows why. This is not a cyber attack. It's just short-sightedness in the original programming, legacy software technical debt problem. But as a result, like ambulances and police can't get dispatched. So, and they have other examples in there again. It's a very interesting article. I highly recommend it. I thought it was really eye-opening. Like, yeah, I could see how this is going to be an increasing problem as we add software into everything, and that software gets more complex and more interconnected in our increasingly software-defined world. So here's a couple examples of this. The second thing that made me make the shift was the OWASP Top 10, which I'll get to in a minute. So just recently, Ford recalls 254,000 SUVs over software that can disable safety features. Wired did a big story almost 10 years ago that caused a giant Chrysler recall where hackers worked with a reporter at Wired and were able to demonstrate how over the air they could take control of a Jeep Grand Cherokee and do all kinds of things to it. Do you really think, and also, I have a bunch of links at the back of this presentation. I think I have a link to this in there. If not, I'll throw it in before I send it to Shannon. But if you haven't seen it, Mozilla, the people that make Firefox, have a website called Privacy Not Included. And they did a big expose a couple of years ago on modern cars and how they're basically rolling Orwellian dystopian spy machines. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to check it out. And again, whether it's software mistakes or so-called features that disable things, your car, smart, that unquote, like so many of these devices, has now all this surface area of attack for bad guys. Or it could just be error in the code that causes some sort of catastrophic thing. Imagine, and I'm not the only person that's raised this, there are many people out there smarter than me focused on automotive security. Imagine at 5 p.m. on a Friday night, some adversarial nation state actor decides to make every Ford or every GM or fill in the blank, I'm not here to pick on any one particular vendor, just accelerate until it can't accelerate anymore because they find a flaw in the code that would allow that. When I first started driving many moons ago, didn't have to worry about that because everything was mechanical. And that's one of the things that they talk about, or computers were first starting to be introduced in cars for things like fuel injection, right? Now everything is controlled by the computer. Again, leading to that awesome place we're at now where you buy a car and you get 3 months of heated seats or 3 months of heated steering wheel, and then they want you to pay a subscription to use that stuff. So there's one example, one real world example recently. Internet of Things, or AKA so-called smart devices. So I could spend the rest of the evening telling you what a pile of garbage the Internet of Things is. Everything about the Internet of Things or so-called smart devices is wrong from the perspective of a consumer. And frankly, to Kentucky's credit, Kentucky recently passed the Consumer Data Privacy Act. If you don't know about that, you should look into it. It's not a great law, but it's way better than what we had, which is nothing. So we're one of like 20 states that have a law now. But my point about the Internet of Things is you have devices that don't need to be smart, yet they are, because A, they can collect enormous amounts of information about you. B, they can give you a freemium model where they either want to upcharge you for features that you unlock or conversely turn features off. And then C, the whole incentive model of this is wrong. These devices are cheap or free in some cases because your information, you are the product, not the customer if you're not paying with money, drives this. They care about speed to market, ease of use, and market share. They do not care about your privacy and security. And again, I could go on and on and on with real world examples of this all night long. So as you might guess, I don't have many smart devices, and the ones that I do have in general are not connected to the internet because it's increasingly difficult to buy something that doesn't have this garbage in it. Also, most of this stuff is coming from adversarial nation states like China. Does it have backdoors built in by design? Who would know? So yeah, not a big fan of the Internet of Things, but my point is, as more and more of these so-called smart devices get plugged in, usually, often in a shadow IT type of way, has someone, unless you have tools that can find this, has someone brought in a smart coffee maker or some other sort of smart device to the office? Is that thing potentially exposed to the internet? Is that a gap that hackers could attack to eventually get into your organizational systems? Absolutely. To help further drive this point home, I love this cartoon. Maybe some of you have seen it before. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's a couple here I think are interesting. I'll be burning the toast if you don't give me some dough. $20 in my PayPal account or only brew decaf. Those are kind of funny, right? Wire my hacker $100 or I'll reverse my motor and blow dirt all over this place. I don't know, some of you may have seen the recent story, and it's pretty well documented, of Roomba sweepers somehow uploading pictures of people on a toilet to the internet. Again, don't take my word for any of this. It's all easily documentable. But a guy recently bought a $2,000 robot sweeper from some Chinese company I'd never heard of. And he happened to be an engineer and have some software skills, got to hacking around in there because he wanted to be able to control it with a game controller. Again, look this up for yourself. After he got into the code, he realized that he was able to talk directly to their servers, the secrets that he needed to get into their admin portal were there. And he basically had control over 7,000 of these devices around the world, including their microphone and camera. What could go wrong? But the thing that really I want to drive home here is look at your fire alarm / smoke detector up there. $30 in Bitcoin, and the next time I smell smoke, I might just let you sleep. That's where we're at with this stuff. It is complete garbage. The less of it you have, the better. You need to be this guy. I wish I would have come up with this myself. Tech enthusiasts. My entire house is smart. Tech workers. The only piece of technology in my house is a printer, and I keep a gun next to it so I can shoot it if it makes a noise I don't recognize. Which gets us to here. I love this image because I think it does a nice job of visualizing the point I'm trying to make, that as we add more and more software into things, this thing connects to that thing, uses that thing over here. The complexity keeps increasing. We are more and more reliant on this stuff to operate our society, including our critical infrastructure. And for the average person who doesn't understand any of this, do you think the average person understands how to change the default settings in their new smart TV? Do you think the average person has any idea what kind of data it's collecting with automatic content recognition, how to make sure that it gets updated, how that most of these smart devices after 2 years or less don't get any software updates? So all the things that people like me are screaming about all the time, software updates, default passwords. Do you think the average person understands any of that? No. So as we add more and more software into things, again, coming from a software guy, Our keyboard is like a grenade. You press the wrong key, it blows yourself up, blows you up, blows your family up, blows your organization up. And as we get more interconnected, potentially the whole society. So here are some recent examples. Local Cincinnati media market, Kettering Health. This is a fairly good sized health chain out of Dayton that's worked its way down towards Cincinnati, hit with a ransomware attack, systems down. They had some systems down for over a month. They had to transfer people to other hospitals and so forth. There are documented cases where in Germany where people died because of a ransomware attack on a hospital, and patients had to be transferred from one hospital to another. Is that a configuration problem? Is it a weak software problem? Who knows, because of the increasing complexity. But go to a hospital, everything has software in it. Everything is a sensor. Everything is industrial Internet of Things now, right? And the point I'm trying to make here is not to throw this particular chain under the bus because they're big. They have cybersecurity experts on staff. They have resources. They know what they're doing. As we add more and more complexity in, more and more things that are connected, that attack surface just keeps growing, and it's increasingly having effects on us in the real world. There's another story recently out of the UK last year, 158-year-old business hit with a ransomware attack. Now, this is another topic I like to speak on, resiliency. Everyone loves the cool cybersecurity tools and all that sort of stuff, right? The penetration testing, red teaming, and all that sort of stuff. We still do not focus enough on resiliency, building systems that can recover quickly with minimal impact and minimal downtime. I have firsthand knowledge of a company here in Cincinnati that we talked to. The owner's like, oh, I got a guy. My brother's uncle's cousin does my IT, backups, got all that. I'm good to go. They're out of business now. And I know this because I happen to know their accountant. They got hit with a ransomware attack. Their backup was an external drive on the server that got hit with ransomware. They're out of business. So here's the story out of the UK, 158-year-old business hit with a ransomware attack. They did not have resilient systems. They couldn't recover. 700 people lose their jobs. 158-year-old business toast. Maybe you've seen this story. Also out of the UK late last year, Jaguar Land Rover hit with a ransomware attack. They were down for almost 2 months. As you can see here in some of these details, cyber attack, prolonged production shutdown. 25% of suppliers have already taken steps to pause production and lay off workers. And that attack is forced a complete halt until October 1st, costing the company 1.36 in lost revenue, billion in lost revenue. So that's just the lost revenue. That's not the forensics cost. That's not the recovery cost. And 200,000 jobs across the supply chain. That was as of that time. It went on later than that. I couldn't find more recent numbers. I didn't have time to really update this as much as I'd hoped today. But you can see just how devastating this one attack is. If this were 30, 40, 50 years ago, you wouldn't even be able to pull off something like this because you wouldn't have all this interconnectivity. You wouldn't have to worry about this sort of thing. So again, I'm not trying to be a Luddite here. I've been in tech my whole life. That's all I've ever done. I'm saying we are moving way too fast with this stuff. We're not considering the societal impact that ultimately affects us all in the real world like this. People getting laid off, people losing their jobs, companies going out of business, and then ultimately kinetic effects on hospital chains, critical infrastructure like water and so forth. We're moving way too fast on this stuff, and the incentives are wrong. But more on that in a minute. The most recent example. Now, this one kind of hit close to home for me because as the mayor of the city here in Northern Kentucky, we have a bunch of equipment from Stryker. If you're not familiar with this, Stryker is a gigantic company, tens of billions in revenue, tens of thousands of employees. They make a variety of medical equipment used in hospitals and doctors' offices and first response like ambulances and so forth. Again, we have a bunch of Stryker equipment sitting over in our fire department, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of this stuff. They get hit with a devastating cyber attack. Now, in this case, it was interesting. It was a wiper attack. I don't want to, if we have time and you want to talk more about it, I can. Very interesting the way they went about this. Wiper, unlike ransomware, is not designed to be recoverable. It just wipes out data. So these are the estimated costs for Stryker. And when this whole thing first went down, I wondered, will Stryker even be able to recover from this? And if not, what does that mean for all the equipment we've invested tens of thousands of dollars in? Will the equipment still function? When an ambulance rolls up in front of my parents' house, for example, in Fort Wright, will the Stryker equipment, also full of software, connected to Stryker servers and so forth, be able to perform its task, or are people going to die as a result of this? Thankfully, that was not the case here. But you can see here, these are estimates, but they estimate $62 to $140 million in loss in direct and indirect costs as a result of this attack. Not to mention the bad will that came along with this. This is the mentality we need to take. Okay, this guy is a guy named Mikko Hipponen. I'm admittedly a huge fanboy of this guy. He's a pretty well-known international cybersecurity expert. Used to be with F-Secure. He's moved on to something else. He does a lot of public speaking on this. He's very insightful, and I just like his approach. And this is him giving a talk here. We're no longer securing computers. We're securing society. As our society is increasingly digital, as we rely on this technology that's now in everything, mostly bad software written by people like me who are not focused on security or privacy, but are focused on speed to market, market share, ease of use, and collecting as much of your data as possible, we do not have the right perspective on this. So before I get into the real meat of this, I want to talk a little bit about third-party risk, and you'll see how this plays into where I want to take the software discussion. So like I mentioned, I spent much of my career as the shadow IT guy, the third-party risk guy. Companies are hiring me to build software for them, often with little or no input from IT or security people. We're hosting it in some cloud-based service somewhere. And I'll be the first person to tell you, before I got on the security bandwagon, I did every kind of bad practice you can imagine, some of which you'll see in the OWASP top 10 here shortly. I've stored passwords as plain text. I've stored secrets in configuration files because, frankly, I did not understand the risk and didn't really care. I was mostly focused on, can I get this done on time and budget? If you think your average developer in China putting all the software in all these so-called smart devices cares about any of the things I just mentioned, you are sadly mistaken, right? So third-party risk, the idea that you have threats and vulnerabilities due to other external relationships, suppliers, vendors, contractors, service providers, and customers. More and more stuff is getting outsourced to the cloud. More and more stuff is using third-party APIs, libraries, et cetera. The days of monolithic software on a mainframe, like when I first graduated from college and got into this business, are for the most part gone, right? I can also tell you there were many, many, many times where as a software engineer working on a project for some customer, I needed some functionality, right? Could I write it myself? Well, depending on what it is, maybe. But why would I want to spend hours, days, weeks writing something, testing something, if I can just go out and do a search and find something that claims to do what I want? Any of you who've done software development, I'm sure have done this, right? Whether it's Python and pip, or it's Visual Studio and I can't think of what the thing's called now. You just go do a search and, oh, here's a library that claims to do what you want. Countless times I've just downloaded these things, have no idea where it came from, and tried it. Did it work? Okay, boom, I move on. I have no idea. Does it have backdoors in it? Is it really malware thinly veiled as the thing that I think it's supposed to do? Again, we're going to see examples of this in a minute because I just wasn't focused on that. The security aspects of it, the potential consequences to my customer, to my business never really occurred to me. I was just focused on how can I get this done, right? With minimal effort. You got third-party risk. Again, you'll hear the term supply chain risk, or in this particular context, software supply chain risk. It's getting worse and worse and worse. Some of the world's worst hacks are due to third parties. The Target hack, for example. You know, about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, Target had a devastating hack. All kinds of consumer information was stolen, not because the hackers broke into Target. The hackers targeted HVAC contractors who had access to Target systems. They hacked the HVAC contractor systems to get into the Target systems. There's the recent Snowflake breach of a few years ago where AT&T and a bunch of other huge companies had their data stolen through misconfigurations using Snowflake to analyze their data, right? So as you outsource things, and I'm generally a fan of the cloud and I'm generally a fan of outsourcing, if you don't understand how to configure things correctly, and if you're not dealing with reputable vendors who are focused on things like the third-party risk they're bringing to you through their vendors, aka fourth-party risk, we'll look at that in a minute, you are vastly increasing your risk with limited visibility into what that risk is and what the impact could be. New SEC incident disclosure requirements actually call out third-party risk as a material business risk. I was very happy to see this. We're well past
Go ahead.
time.
Don't let me get in the way of your charity.
We're well past time to think about how these are material risks to businesses. Come here, and the SEC final rule, which came out about 2 years ago, says 98% of organizations use at least one third-party vendor that has been breached in the last 2 years. right? That's a stat from the Securities and Exchange Commission. That's something I came up with. And that was part of their thinking for the final rule that they recently came out with around disclosure around this. They mentioned in the SEC final rule, third party 39 separate times. That's how important it is to their thinking about how this affects businesses now. And basically, you get third party risk in two basic forms: breach through a vendor or partner. Could be a cloud-based vendor, again, could be a physical vendor doing work on your behalf, has access to your systems, who's breached, or it's through free and open source software, right? FOSS. And I have a bunch of stats in here. I couldn't find anything more recent than the stats I'm going to show you, but I would say what the numbers you're about to see here have only gone up, not down, right? So per this open source security and risk analysis report, free and open source software accounts for 75% of all code bases on average. There's some open source software in 75% of all code bases, right? Third-party risks bring on operational disruptions, financial losses, reputational damage, data breaches, which gets you back to financial loss and reputational damage, especially as more states adopt some kind of consumer data protection laws. Again, Kentucky is one of about 20 states that have done this. Several other states have one in the pipeline. Kentucky's, as I mentioned before, it's not great. As a consumer, you should learn how it can work for you. And it does have some teeth for larger data breaches. So businesses now have a reason to care about this if they're doing business in Kentucky. But again, that's a separate topic. Compliance violations, things like HIPAA, things like high trust, things like CMMC, right? You now have to care about this depending on what line of business you're in. And then you have fourth party risk. I mentioned this before, your vendors. You're using some sort of cloud-based service, and their software calls an API that uses a library that calls an API that uses a library. Again, turtles all the way down kind of mentality. You have risk through those things if you don't understand what they're doing. And sometimes it's unknowable, right? You can't really know what's behind there. But these are things you need to think about, because at the end of the day, when a breach occurs, it's on your organization, right? You're ultimately accountable for that. Significant cyber threat that an extended, complex, and invisible web of interconnected business relationships creates. Again, my API uses your library, which calls some other API, which I don't know anything about. And again, that gets you to this sort of idea of it's turtles all the way down in terms of this risk. And as we outsource more things to the cloud, to third parties, that risk continues to go up, and it's something you need to think about. So let's talk a little bit more about development, then we'll come back to this idea of third-party risk and how it ultimately drives much of what I'm going to talk about here tonight. Everybody wants to create more software more quickly with less cost. As I mentioned before, the days of gigantic proprietary internal code bases are for the most part over. More people are using third-party and fourth-party tools to offset the cost to build this stuff. Microservices are a common way. Again, microservice, fancy name, think API. You've got citizen development out there, which is a term that's sort of fallen out of disfavor. The idea that people are using low code and no code tools to generate software. In many cases, they have no idea what they're doing, and they don't know anything about security, but they're able to use these tools to throw out code. And then you have another one of my favorite things that I could spend a whole night on, quote, vibe coding, which for the most part is just creating complete garbage. As soon as you change something that you didn't really understand how it worked in the first place, now the whole thing is broken, and you have no idea what the security posture of this stuff is. So yeah, not a fan of this either. Not because I'm against the potential productivity boost, because you have people who don't really know what they're doing, building stuff with little thought to the potential risk it's creating for themselves, their organizations, and our society as a whole. APIs, right? If you've done any kind of programming, chances are you've been exposed to some kind of API. And I mean, the whole idea of an API is pretty fantastic. I'm old enough to remember where I would be working on an application for customer X who wanted to exchange information with customer Y. And I would have to get with them, and we'd be using things like FTP or SFTP. We'd have to agree on like a CSV format. Then someone would change something, and one column would change positions, and the whole program would blow up, right? So the whole idea of an API is, okay, here's a set of rules that tell you what you can and can't do. And, maybe you log in, maybe you have an API key, whatever. But I'm exposing this functionality, the underlying database structure, the underlying logic, all that is hidden, right? I only get access to what I need through the API is really pretty ingenious. So I'm a fan of APIs, but they bring their own set of issues, right? And usually you have limited to no visibility into the API code itself, including any dependencies it has. And we're going to get deep into this dependencies thing here in a minute. Things like broken authentication, broken object level authorization, excessive data exposure, security misconfiguration, injection attacks, insufficient logging and monitoring, and ultimately, again, lack of visibility. I can't know what's powering that API. Are they using code that has known vulnerabilities? Are they using code that's no longer maintained by the original developer of that library or whatever? Who knows? And we're going to talk about solutions for this in a minute. Open source software continues its rise. Again, we saw roughly 75% of code bases have it. And I'm not against open source, but you have to understand that if you don't have visibility into the dependencies and the vulnerabilities, you have a problem, right? Again, the whole idea of you're running something that's no longer supported, it's out of date, it has known vulnerabilities, potentially. There's all kinds of different ways open source code gets into your libraries. Again, I will be the first person to admit there are countless times where I went out and found some third-party library or some API that claimed to do something I needed, did no vetting on it. I tried it, it worked, I moved on. There's probably still software out there, and you can see this is from OWASP 2019, that I wrote more than 10 years ago. Who knows what kind of vulnerabilities it has in it? Now this, I couldn't find a more recent chart in time for this presentation tonight, but I think this is kind of interesting. You can see here total number of vulnerabilities in software, right? So notice you see like a hockey stick like spike upward. I want to throw out here though, there's three reasons for that. One is a legitimate reason. There's more software than ever before, so of course there are more vulnerabilities. Naturally, there are going to be more vulnerabilities if there's more software, right? But you also have more people looking for vulnerabilities now. People like Palo Alto Unit 42 and Google Project Zero. You have AI tools that can find these things. So naturally, if you have more software and you're looking for vulnerabilities, naturally you're going to find more. So this in and of itself to me it's not good, but it's not totally disturbing, okay? This is a lot more disturbing. So CVE, Common Vulnerability Enumeration, notice the vulnerabilities are going up, right? But this is really the disturbing one, the severity of the vulnerabilities, right? It's not just that there are more vulnerabilities. Again, more software, more people looking, of course there are. It's that the risk of the impact of the vulnerabilities continues to go up. And to some extent, that's because we rely on the software to do more things that exposes the code to create more real-world impacts. Ponemon here says 50% of security breaches were due to vulnerabilities in unpatched software. I mentioned before, do you think the average person that buys some so-called smart device knows how to patch the software in it, knows if it's being patched, knows when the vendor has cut off updates for it? Of course they don't. And yet they buy more and more of this stuff and plug it in flat networks where it has access to anything in the network. 34% of cybercrime victims were aware of holes but didn't patch them in time. 37% of breach victims don't perform regular scans to find vulnerabilities in their own systems. Super disturbing. And again, all the sources are linked either in the slide here or at the end. Synopsys said open source security and risk analysis audited a total of 1,703 code bases, 96% contained open source. Of the 1,700 they audited, 89% contained open source that was more than 4 years out of date. So it hasn't been updated for 4 years. Who knows what vulnerabilities there are in there? 54% of the audited code bases contain code bases with license conflicts. That's another problem I don't really focus on here. I care less about the licensing than the security risks of this. 1,481 of the code bases had 84% contained at least one vulnerability. 48% contained at least one high-risk vulnerability. This is from that same study there, so I won't repeat all of this. But notice this, 15% of code bases using more than 10 versions of a component. So in this context, then component API, library, module, something like that, right? You have multiple developers working on something. They don't talk to each other. They don't have a good way for visibility. I've been involved in this situation before too, where, Cindy Lou Who downloads component X. I download component Y for the same functionality, different versions. Now I have these two dependencies, So again, you could see this is not an ideal situation, from a maintainability and sustainability perspective of code, but more importantly, from a privacy and security standpoint. So the OWASP top 10, I mentioned this before. Hopefully you all are familiar with OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project. They've been around for a long time, and I've sort of followed this, and this is what started to make me pay attention to security at all in the software engineering field. And also, as I mentioned, I've been an instructor for this stuff for more than 20 years. We do not really focus on this. I bring it up because it's important to me, but the curriculum itself does not get deep into this because there's just really not enough time. And it's hard enough for most people just to learn how to do software engineering in the first place. So if you look at this, what I'm trying to show here with the colors is in 2003, broken access control was an item, right? And the top 10, these are the top 10 things that OWASP is saying are security problems in software, right? Notice in 2017, broken access control shows up again, and it's still there in 2021. Now, they just recently updated this again in 2025. What I'm trying to show you here is roughly every 3 to 4 years, they'll update this list based on what they're seeing out there in the real world. Notice cross-site scripting is in there for almost 20 years, right? Identification and authentication in there multiple times. Broken authentication and session management. But the one that really got me, okay? The one that really drove this home for me is injection flaws, AKA SQL injection. It doesn't have to be SQL injection, it could be any kind of injection. But if you really dig down into this, since 2003, SQL injection, right? It's there in 2003, it's there in 2010, it's there in 2013, it's there in 2017, it's there in 2021. For roughly 20 years, SQL injection has been one of the most common problems in software. Now, for those of you doing software, you should probably know SQL injection is one of the easiest things in the world to fix, right? Parameterized queries or stored procedures, the problem just goes away. And yet, for 20 years, this is still one of the most common problems in software, which tells me people are not being educated about this, people are not being trained on this, and if they are, they just don't care. And admittedly, I was that person at one time. I didn't know about it, and then when I did know about it, I started using things like stored procedures, but a lot of times I'd use stored procedures for different reasons. It wasn't just the security aspect. This knowledge has been out there forever, and yet for more than 20 years, one of the simplest problems to solve is one of the biggest problems in software development. So here's a couple of examples. Man's entire life destroyed after downloading AI software. I have a link to this. It's a fascinating story. This guy was a developer for Disney. He thought he was going to download this component that was going to make everything better. It was basically thinly veiled malware. I know I'm going to run out of time if I don't pick this up. Open source developer corrupts widely used libraries, affecting tons of projects. Look at the story date on this, 2022. So as far back as 2022, it was already documented that people were doing this. He went into a widely used library. Again, think, hey, I need functionality that does X. Here's a library, I did a search, found it on Reddit, whatever. Here it is, I'm going to pull down this thing. It was purposely, maliciously hacked to blow up the projects that were using that code. The SolarWinds attack in 2020. If you're not familiar with this, this is worth looking into. So SolarWinds makes a software product, amongst other things, called Orion. Companies like ours, we're an MSP, use Orion. We don't use Orion. We use other remote management and monitoring tools. But the bad guys were able to get into the repository, put a backdoor in the Orion software. So now the thousands of companies that are using Orion pull down the latest updates, and the bad guys not only have access into SolarWinds, but all of the companies using Orion. Whether it's, I want to shut these companies down, I want to steal their trade secrets, I want to figure out how to get money from them, think about that. You have managed to manipulate a tool that people are using to manage their environment, a tool that's trusted. You've planted a backdoor in it that now gives you access to thousands of companies. It's ingenious as heck, but again, shows you, in my opinion, the abysmal state of software security. More recently, if you haven't seen this, critical Python supply chain compromise, how a library used by millions of AI developers got infected with malware. This light LLM Python library, same kind of situation. Bad guys hack it, you download this thing, it basically steals everything off your device, your passwords, everything. It's got it all. Totally wild, look into it. Absolutely terrible situation. And then most recently, attack on Axios software developer tool threatens widespread compromises. Researchers at numerous firms are sounding warnings about a supply chain attack on an open source project with 100 million weekly downloads. So if you're using Axios, which is used for all kinds of things in your code, you have this problem potentially. What might be worse is you're using an API that has this problem, or you're using a library that has this problem, and you don't even know you have the problem because you don't know that they have used this thing. Thus, the idea of third-party risk and fourth-party risk, and the fact that this thing has a dependency on that thing, has a dependency on this other thing. And sadly, the bad guys are very smart, very creative, very devious, and they are increasingly going for these software supply chain attacks because rather than spending an hour or a day or a week trying to hack company X, if I can get into the software company X is using through a trusted mechanism like the vendor is hacked, the vendor pushes out an update, and now you're in my system, well, that's a super win for these guys. And these are showing up more and more often. You can see that last story, March 25th. This was dateline March 31st. I promise you, you're going to see more and more of this, especially with vibe-coded garbage where people have no idea what they're doing and aren't thinking anything about this. And this is why I keep coming back to, unless we get serious about the security of software and how it's impacting society, we are in deep trouble. That gets us to secure by design. So the good news is there are a lot of smart people out there thinking about this and trying to deal with it. Secure by Design is a program from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the goal being to get companies that build software to think about security first, to think about the impact on society, to think about software that's robust and resilient and secure and private, rather than speed to market, market share, ease of use, and sucking up as much data as possible. Over 200 organizations have signed on to this. There's no real teeth in it, but at least it's moving us in the right direction. You have Executive Order 14028 from back in 2021, which gets me to what I really want to focus on tonight, software bill of materials. The best defense against all of this right now is software bill of materials. From the executive order, you can see providing a purchaser a software bill of materials or SBOM for each product directly or by publishing it on a public website. This is a requirement from the executive order. All U.S. government software vendors were required to submit documentation, including SBOMs, by September 14th, 2023, or June 11th if the software was deemed critical. So again, that executive order was out there in 2021. There's all kinds of guidance for how to do this kind of thing correctly out there. Guidance from NIST, guidance from CISA, guidance from the NSA. So you can see here, this is a government website, Securing the Software Supply Chain, Recommended Practices for Software Bill of Materials Consumption. So this whole idea of software bill of materials is not new. And again, I'm going to try to pick up my pace here. Bottom line is comprehensive list of components, materials, parts, and sub-assemblies required to manufacture a product. That's what a bill of materials is. Holdover from the manufacturing space, right? Crucial document in various industries, detailed breakdown of the items needed to create a product along with relevant information such as quantities, part numbers, descriptions, and sometimes even costs, right? So here's an example of what a bill of materials might look like for a skateboard, right? You have the highest level thing, the skateboard, then you have assemblies like, wheels, board, axle, screws, and then you have sub-assemblies all the way down to the bottom level parts, but it shows you the dependencies you need to put a product together, and that gets us to SBOMs. Again, I have been on the SBOM bandwagon really ever since I discovered it. Admittedly, back in the day when I was doing this, I didn't know what it was. It wasn't really a thing then, and I would have probably said, oh, that's just a lot of extra work you don't need. But when you see these real-world attacks on hospital chains, just saw a story this morning. There was a water plant in Minot, South Dakota that was hit with a ransomware attack. There have been other water plants attacked in the United States where they were able to change the amount of chemicals going into the water. The FBI has had a joint advisory with the NSA, DHS, and CISA just within the last week about attacks on critical infrastructure from Iranian actors, specifically water plants, right? If you had an SBOM and you knew everything that was in the software you were using, all the dependencies all the way down to that lowest level, you could know if there was a vulnerability. You could know if it was out of date. You could know if it wasn't patched, right? So SBOM, formal record containing details of supply chain relationships, the dependencies in your software, the APIs, the libraries, everything in it. Enumerates components in a product, provides a detailed inventory of all third-party and open source components, libraries, frameworks, and dependencies. Allows the developer to ensure components are up to date, respond quickly to new vulnerabilities, also lets you know if you have a licensing problem. Again, I'm a lot less concerned about the licensing than I am the vulnerabilities. A nested inventory, a list of ingredients that make up software components. That's a definition from CISA that I think Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency does a good job of explaining what it really is. You can use an SBOM to perform vulnerability or license analysis. If you have software, the SBOM allows you to figure out where your risks are, right? Is this dependency out of date? Is this dependency got a known vulnerability? It gives you that kind of insight in a way that is machine usable as well, right? So another definition, this came from McKinsey, a formal machine readable inventory of software components and dependencies which result from combining various OSS, open source components, third-party code, and code developed in-house, technical information about those components, and the code's hierarchical relationship. You know, what help you know that you have 10 different versions of the same component, right? And you could get that down to one, and now you only have to worry about the one. Because for those of you who've done software development, I'm sure you've been in a situation where you fix something that breaks something else, right? That's why you have regression testing and all these kind of things, right? Having 10 different versions of a component and trying to maintain all 10 is just a recipe for disaster, not just from a security perspective, but from a usability and sustainability perspective. This came from McKinsey as well, kind of explains how this works. Developers often include libraries or packages in software without knowing their origin. The software bill of materials lists the software components, and then it gives you, some kind of idea of what this might look like for a thing. And again, I freely admit, I used to do this sort of thing all the time. As soon as I found something that worked, I would plug it in without another thought to, is this going to be problematic? Is it really thinly veiled malware? Like some of the things we've seen here, I would just move on. Why use an SBOM? Identify and correct vulnerabilities, create transparency, qualify vendors, manage software supply chain risk, verify license compliance. It's the foundation for zero trust, which basically boils down to trust nothing, verify everything, every time. And really, it's indicative of a developer or supplier's application of secure development practices. And it makes you compliant with NIST SP 800-161 and Executive Order 1428. So if you're providing software to the government, you have to do this. Again, long overdue in my opinion. Linux Foundation research team said 51% of organizations say SBOMs make it easier for developers to understand dependencies across components. 49% say SBOMs make it easier to monitor components for vulnerabilities. Again, how could they not? That's really one of the fundamental drivers. 44% say SBOMs make it easier to manage license compliance. This kind of gives you an idea of how it will work, right? So you have an SBOM, you verify the SBOM, you store the SBOM in a metadata repository. You use the SBOM, and we're going to talk more about some of this in just a second before we run out of time. And then you determine, is this an acceptable risk score? Yes. Well, then get the updated software and plug it in and use it. Or no, go back to the drawing board, which might be use a different component, roll it yourself or whatever. But again, it's giving you detailed insight into every aspect of the software down to the lowest levels so you can understand the kind of vulnerabilities that might be in there and the issues you may run into. There's just a quick screenshot of what the inside of an SBOM looks like. You can see it's just JSON. Who uses an SBOM? Traditionally used by compliance teams, but increasingly used by security teams and development teams who are now ideally working together and seeing each other as allies. Now my whole perspective on this has changed. Of course, I am a security person now, but I would see them as my ally. Ideally coming early in the process. You all know it's much easier to build something in up front than to retrofit it in later, but ideally working together. This just sort of explains what's in an SBOM, and I'm just going to hit this real fast. So the National Telecommunications and Information Administration released the minimum elements for a software bill of materials per Executive Order 1428, and you can see the items that it should include. There are 3 machine-readable formats. Unfortunately, we don't have standardization on this. I don't know why. I guess because it would be too simple to just have one standardized format for this, but you can see there are 3 different machine-readable formats for an SBOM. Ideally, every time you generate a new version of code, you would generate a new SBOM. Most modern IDEs like Visual Studio will do this for you. Explain the dependencies that may exist but are unknown to the developer. For the sake of time, I'm going to go through this real quick. Software product data exchange is one of the formats. Software identification tagging is another format. And then Cyclone DX. That came from the OWASP community, and that would be the one I would probably lean towards if I were still doing this, only because I'm a big fan of OWASP. They provide an enormous amount of value in the software security space. Then you have this idea of foundational capabilities. So every SBOM really should do these things. Again, for the sake of time and to be able to work some questions in here, I'm just going to blast through this real quick. But ideally, any SBOM should meet these foundational capabilities. Then there's this idea of sustaining capabilities, additional things that are nice to haves. and then finally enhancing capabilities, so that really, in a perfect world, if you could just get everything you want, it would include all of that. There are different types of SBOMs, and it depends basically on when they're created in the development process. Again, for the sake of time, I won't read all this to you, but you got design SBOM all the way down to runtime SBOM. And you can see there, runtime SBOM generated through instrumenting the system running the software to capture only components present in the system. So you've got different things to do it, or different levels where it comes in. You can create SBOMs manually. You can use software composition analysis tools, or you can use the software build process in more advanced IDEs like Eclipse or Visual Studio. Software composition analysis process and a set of tools aimed at identifying and assessing software components. Thorough examination of the software's code base to create an inventory of all components and dependencies. And primary goal is to manage and mitigate security, licensing, and compliance risks. Here are some well-known SCA tools. Vulnerability exchange. This is something that sort of bolts onto an SBOM. As you can see, not technically part of an SBOM, can exist independently. Machine-readable security advisor that indicates if a product is affected by known vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities identified in the SBOM may overstate the actual risks of the product. This is an important thing to understand too, despite all the doom and gloom I'm throwing here. Just because you get like a CVE score or a CVSS score of 10, right? It may be a high severity vulnerability, but it might not apply to you. For example, if you don't have Wi-Fi and it affects Wi-Fi somehow, well, it's not a real risk. And that's why it's always important to consider the risk of these things. Just because a vulnerability has a high severity rating does not necessarily mean it's going to impact you or impact you at the same level that it might for someone else. VEX helps to prioritize vulnerability risk, which again, if I have 10 vulnerabilities and all 10 of them come up as 10s on severity, but only 3 of them actually affect my environment and the way I'm using the software, well, I'm going to want to focus on those first, right? So it's a way to prioritize. And then finally, to kind of wrap up here, back to secure by design. I just can't stress enough. It is so critical that people get on board with this CISA idea of secure by design, this CISA program, that we focus on security first, robustness first, stability first, privacy first, not as an afterthought or never, because the product is basically thinly veiled malware, right? And then secure by default. Ideally, out of the box, stuff is secure. You don't have to spend more money to add stuff to it. All of the basic table stakes stuff like MFA and logging and so forth are built into the product, so that, again, I'm building it with security in mind, and I'm putting the tools in place to make it secure by default, not to have some advanced skills or additional licensing or whatever to make the product secure. So to kind of wrap up here, in my opinion, we've gone from the SBOMs, nice to have, we just simply must have them if we don't want our whole society to burn down. I mean, imagine in a world with central bank digital currency and digital cash only, the risk we would be at when the electricity goes off because the grid goes down due to some bad software, right? It doesn't even have to be a cyber attack. It could just be some bad software. So as we get more and more digital, this is becoming absolutely critical, in my opinion. And the good news is there are more people aware of it. There are more people talking about it, which is why I'm going to talk about it with you all tonight. Allows you to identify and correct vulnerabilities. It does ensure licensing compliance. Again, I'm much less concerned about that. It's a way for you as a software producer to demonstrate quality and security, protect the growing software supply chain. Again, everything is smart. Everything's got software in it now. Allows you to focus on risk. Like I said, you may have 10 vulnerabilities. Which one is the most critical one? Which one needs to get fixed first, right? Gartner said 60% of organizations building or procuring critical software will mandate and standardize SBOMs by 2025. I couldn't find anything to back that up, but I hope that number continues to go up. Linux Foundation says, when I say back it up, I mean, that is a direct quote from Gartner. I couldn't find any stats that number was achieved in 2025. Linux Foundation said 78% of organizations expected to produce or consume SBOMs as far back as 2022. I don't believe we're anywhere near that, unfortunately. Executive Order 1428, U.S. government software vendors are required to submit SBOMs. So again, but the government is at least leading in the government space, requiring vendors to do this, which is good. And really, as people in tech, whether you're a software engineer or whatever you do, as people in tech, you really need to get on the bandwagon of proselytizing for this, to get people to focus on the security and robustness of software and use tools like SBOMs to facilitate that, as opposed to the surveillance capitalism model that we all live under now. Everybody needs an SBOM. Every software should have an SBOM. I'm happy to answer any questions. There's me in my tinfoil hat. Yes, I am a tinfoil hat person. And then one last quote there, which I really like. Cybersecurity is national security. That's from former Army General and former NSA Director, Paul Nakasone. There's all my contact information. You know, if I can help you with your career, your education or whatever, feel free to look me up on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find. Yes, that is a legitimate QR code. Sometimes I'll throw a bogus one in here because the average person also does not know that QR codes can be malicious and will scan virtually anything. There's some of the resources I mentioned for more detail about this stuff, some good X accounts to follow for more information on this stuff. And yeah, that's it. So again, I'm happy to answer any questions. Appreciate the opportunity to get on my soapbox about this tonight, because it's something I feel as someone who did all of the wrong things for a very long time, and increasingly seeing the risk and real world examples of companies I've seen go out of business because of this stuff. I'm very concerned about it.
Dave, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I think I asked you this last time, but we have a whole new batch of students with us, and I know some of them are in the cybersecurity class. What sort of advice do you have for folks who are wanting to pursue a role in cybersecurity?
Well, the job market around cybersecurity now is really brutal. Most of what I see on the entry level end are, you know, they want you to have 10 years of experience in a tool that's only existed for 2 months. I would say one of the areas of opportunity, because most people don't really understand it, don't like it, and aren't interested in it, is the whole GRC space, government or governance, regulatory and compliance, policies, procedures, documentation, compliance with frameworks like CMMC, HIPAA, et cetera. Because, you know, it generally involves a lot of writing, and it doesn't involve all the cool red teaming, penetration testing, tool stuff that everyone likes, which I get, right? I understand that. But I would say that's a space to look into. Anything you can do to get some practical experience that you can demonstrate, anything you can do to get into IT and then potentially shift around is going to help. I can just tell you, for most people, it's very unrealistic that they're going to suddenly walk into a role as a penetration tester or SOC analyst or something. I can't say it never happens, but I can tell you it's very unlikely. So, you know, if you really want to break into the field, be open-minded, get something going in IT. Again, get demonstrable skills, look into certifications, although they won't necessarily be a guarantee to a job. My argument on certifications is you will be forced to learn things you didn't know, and it does demonstrate some discipline and willingness to push yourself forward. But again, I wouldn't spend all your time and money on it. I can promise you just having certifications are not going to be a guarantee to getting a job. Go out and network. I put together a list of all of the Cincinnati-based IT, and particularly cybersecurity-related organizations I could think of, like Kentuckiana ISSA down your way is a good organization to get involved in. You know, find the IT-related industry organizations in the greater Louisville area, maybe even Lexington or even as far up as Cincinnati, depending on, you know, where you want to go. Get involved. Go network. Go to conferences. We have a conference every year in Cincinnati called Queen City Con. It's a 3-day event in November. You know, as a student, you can generally go for free. It's a great way to learn a bunch of stuff from professionals like me, as well as make a lot of connections, talk to vendors that are there, hawking their wares. You know, when I first got into this, like when I was in college, I was the most introverted, nerdy guy you could imagine. I love this joke. I like to tell it all the time. You know, how do you know you're talking to the extroverted programmer in the room? Well, they look at your shoes when they're talking to you. I mean, I was that guy to the nth degree. And frankly, you know, in trying to run my own business, I eventually learned like how to talk to people, and that if I wanted to eat, I had to go sell things and talk to people and so forth. I know that a lot of tech people are sort of naturally introverted. I get it. I used to be that guy. But I'm telling you, the best thing you can do for yourself, besides get demonstrable skills, try to get internships, is get out and network. Go to these industry organizations, go to meetings where you can meet other people who will be generally very helpful. They'll want to help you, especially once they get to know you. So more networking, and any kind of experience you can get where you can demonstrate that experience will go a long way towards opening the door. And again, be open-minded. Yes, you may want to be a penetration tester, but you may need to make multiple steps to get there. And if you say, I'm only going to be a penetration tester, you're going to make your life really difficult.
Yeah, I think that's some great advice. And that's a lot of what we share really with all of our pathways at this point. I think the networking piece is huge. And as I'm thinking about being a job seeker later this year, I'm definitely thinking about who's in my network and what events I can go to. So we always recommend
So
that.
Shannon,
And
one more thing I've done in there again, like if you go to my Substack, you'll find the list of the Cincinnati organizations I put together. It's also got some Dayton in it. And I'm not that familiar with Louisville because I don't get down there that often. Again, I am familiar with Kentuckiana ISSA. The other thing I would say is you'll see if you connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm a shameless self-promoter. I freely admit it. I'm all about it. I'm out there all the time. I'm doing stuff like this all the time, and I promote the heck out of it. And I will just say this, while that may be uncomfortable to you, it was to me at one time. I've got almost 17,000 LinkedIn connections. People are constantly connecting with me. They're not going away. So whatever I can at least anecdotally argue, whatever I'm doing is not driving people away. If you want to get a job, if you want to be successful, trust me, it will be a lot easier for you, no matter how difficult it might be from an introversion perspective and how uncomfortable it might feel to do it. You'll be much better off if you get out there in front of people and expose yourself and get to know folks. It will make it much easier.
yeah, absolutely agree. And just as a reminder for everybody, we have the Tech Events channel in Slack where we share events that are going on. And if you all ever come across any you want to share, please feel free to post them in there. But we try to keep that really populated with both in-person and virtual events for you all to check out. Does anybody else have a question for Dave before we go for tonight? Yeah, Sean.
So just real quick, so I'm in the front end development program here. How hard would you say it would be switching from like the front end development over to like cybersecurity?
Well, I mean, I came out of the programming world, but I would have described myself back in the day as a full stack developer. Also, again, I haven't really done any professional software development since like 2016. So things have changed drastically since I was doing it. I always hated the front end stuff. My graphic capabilities are virtually zero. I'm much better at SQL and back end coding than the front end stuff, but I could do it all. My guess is in today's market, it will be hard to make the shift. I was fortunate in that because I got to be pretty well known around Cincinnati and I was heavily networked and I had referred business to a lot of other companies because we only did software. That's it. That's all I did. So if you needed people to support your network, if you needed hosting and all that, I didn't do any of that. And that's how I ended up at Intrust. The founder of Intrust and I have known each other since the 90s. I referred a lot of business to Intrust and vice versa. So again, it was really the networking. When I said, I don't want to work at this insurance company anymore, I don't really want to do software anymore, I really want to focus on security, I was able to leverage my network and the fact that people knew me and knew that I had been talking about this stuff for a long time, despite not really doing it down in the weeds. Again, I don't want to be a downer here, but my guess is it will probably be somewhat difficult. And if you could get yourself a job on the programming side of things, keep learning about cybersecurity, maybe get some certifications, try to get whatever hands-on experience you can. Once you're in the door somewhere, you might be able to transition into a different role as opposed to, I just, even though I've trained on this and skilled in this, now I want to do something else entirely. And keep in mind too, I am not any great wizard at the recruiting, hiring aspect of this, right? I just know what's worked for me, what my students are telling me, and what I see from people I'm talking to out there.
Okay, well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Good luck.
Yeah, I'd say kind of anecdotally, I'd agree with a lot of what Dave said, but really specifically with the Code U courses, we're giving you a solid base and then you have to grow and learn from there. So if you do have an interest in cybersecurity or you do have an interest in another field, I think it's absolutely worth learning those skills and figuring out how to up those skills and kind of add to what you already have.
I agree, Shannon, and I would throw out there's all kinds of resources too, from low cost and free resources to really expensive stuff like SANS. But there's never been more opportunity, whether it's things like Khan Academy, Udemy, Coursera, Hack the Box. There's all kinds of cybersecurity related resources out there where you can start to get some hands-on experience doing some of this stuff. And again, I would throw out there, I think the easiest thing to break into in the cybersecurity field is going to be the least technical stuff like GRC, but it's also the least exciting to most people. And that's why there are a lot of opportunities there. A lot of people don't understand it and or think they don't want to do it. But when you have things like CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, which is now being enforced on contractors in the defense industrial base, and now the GSA has rolled out something almost exactly like it, there are literally tens of thousands of companies who are going to have to go through the CMMC process and get a level 2 certification if they want to maintain their government contracts. And there are people that have to be able to help them understand how to get there, and then the auditors that will audit it. So there's all kinds of different angles out there. A lot of them are not obvious.
Yeah, I think realizing that your first job or several jobs in tech may not be your dream job is really important, and just being open to opportunities out there. One last question that you really kind of just hit on there, Dave, but Ryan asked in the chat about where you would suggest learning more about cybersecurity. So if there is anything you would add to that great list that you just shared. He said in regards to how to build more stable software projects.
Conferences and local industry associations are great. You know, if they're posting that sort of stuff on your Slack about upcoming events for Louisville area conferences, meetups, that sort of thing, I would try to go to as many of those as you can, especially, you know, anything that's closely aligned with what you're looking to do. So you can learn more from the people doing it. You can see what kind of resources they can point you towards. But again, if you just go online and do a search, you'll find all kinds of online tools where you can practice, like, you know, again, Hack the Box. There's another big one whose name is escaping me at the moment. There is a ton of resources out there. That's another thing LinkedIn is good for. You can go out on LinkedIn and just ask a question like, hey, I want to learn more about X. Can you point me in the right direction? And there are people who will help you, right? They will tell you what they know and where to go. But you got to ask, right? You got to be willing to ask and put yourself out there. So get involved with these local organizations, see what you can learn there, see what they're telling you. And again, Coursera, Udemy, there's so much of this stuff out there now. There are the industry organizations themselves like ISC2 and ISACA. You know, you can join those things and take advantage of all kinds of free or low-cost online training through them. CompTIA, there's tons of this stuff out there.
That's great. Well, thanks so much, Dave, and thanks so much, everybody, for attending. I think this was a great talk. We'll be back definitely in a few weeks, but we're trying to get another couple talks scheduled here in the meantime, so just keep an eye out on Slack. But thanks again, everybody, so much, and have a great night.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good luck, everybody.